Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Season 1, Episode 2 of Helstrom. So, going into this now, realizing that I'm like, you know what? This episode seems already very familiar. Why? Because it feels just like the first episode. It feels just like the first episode. The only difference is we kind of switch who the main focus is. Instead of it being very much on Damien's side, we instead are on much more of the Satana side. To ultimately, we are very much getting to know a little bit more about Satana and ultimately having her go through go through the exact same rungs as Damien had from the episode before. Ultimately, everything kind of feels almost copy and paste from episode 1, where we still haven't yet to really get any actual action sequences going on. It doesn't really seem that this episode really drives this story anywhere, or it just kind of still leaves us into utter confusion of what is the whole point of everything and why should I care still, to be brutally honest. I really liked some of the backstory that is kind of going back and forth between Damien and Satana. But other than that, I'm still kind of going into the mode of, again, why should I care? What is going to invest me into keeping my interest into these characters? And it still feels like, again, I want to ask now, what is the purpose of having Caretaker in this show? Ultimately, this is a person that was just randomly cast. It could have just been anybody into this role, and him being put into this episode a little bit more doesn't exactly help me understand why he's even here, to be brutally honest. So, going into this, yeah, it kind of feels like basically we're repeating the pilot episode over, and but reasonably this time around there is something at the end of the episode to allude to something, not only to allude to something, but it seems like Damien is actually having to work and actually do something towards the end of this episode. But a lot of this episode was people just sitting around talking to one another, and it's a show that kind of feels like like basically this show is really starting to feel to me like probably an Agent Carter, or very much just like, if you guys remember the later movies of the Born Identities or the Born Ultimatums, or anything that happened without Matt Damon, was kind of like everybody sitting around in a boardroom talking about how dangerous Matt Damon's character was. And that's what kind of feels like this show is right now. It's just a bunch of people sitting around talking about old times, and we're not really understanding why should I care? Why should I invest in this show? Why? Why does this matter to me? Because everything is slowly trickling out, and that's my real frustration. So, going into this, I'm still wanting to see what happens at least through the next 3 episodes after this, because ultimately, I think once we get through half of this season, it's going to be make or break. To otherwise say, hey, the show still isn't going anywhere. Is it just going to want to wait to the very last episode to give us something to intrigue us to the next season? Is that what it's trying to do? Because ultimately, I don't want the next 3 episodes to just have an entire showcasing of one character, because I feel like that is what this is going to be throughout the rest of this season. Is just going to be like, okay, hey, yeah, we focused an entire episode on Damien. Now we're going to focus an entire episode on Satana. Then the next episode is completely going to be focused on probably Caretaker. The next episode is going to be really focused on these 2 other people, and we're going to be doing flashbacks, and maybe the entire episode is going to be focused on so and so character, and so on and so forth until this show eventually just ends, to where it's just like, okay, now we're just going to throw this ending out there, and that's what it's just going to be. And I'm like, and I will just be utterly just like, really, are you freaking kidding me right now? Because even the quasi villain Ash like person that is in this episode, you just kind of see barely flashes of it happening, and then there's no real action sequence at the end of it. It's just like, why do this? Why go about this route? Um if anything, like, I am just desperate to hope that eventually they're going to be doing something with Ghost Rider down the journeys. I realized that a Hulu show had been canceled with Ghost Rider, but I'm hoping that maybe we're going to get something out of this Helstrom show that is maybe going to tie a Ghost Rider character in. I know full well there had been talks about having a Ghost Rider movie with Keanu Reeves, but ultimately I'm thinking, why is Keanu Reeves being Ghost Rider out of all people? Um, like, I just feel that, like, Keanu Reeves could be a bigger character in the Marvel universe, and because Robbie Reyes doesn't exactly have a big, like, isn't exactly a big thing within the MCU. And so it's just kind of very odd for Keanu Reeves to be Robbie Reyes and to be Ghost Rider. I don't know. So let's go into spoilers about this episode to get it out of the way, because ultimately, besides the backstory, which I find interesting, there's not much going on in this episode again. And in the end, I'm hoping we're going to get there. I hope somebody is going to do something. If anything, I'm hoping that this show isn't going to end up like being like Batwoman, where, like, when you finally get some action sequences, it's like, oh yeah, you can see their stunt double the entire time, or oh, you can just like. And I don't think that's where we're going to, because ultimately, we're who Satana is and who um, Damien seems to be right now is not going to give us a big battle fight out like sequence. Probably until episode 10 is what I'm expecting, because I'm expecting they're going to flush out every single one of these characters that they started to present. That's what I think this show is going to be, sadly enough. And it's going to be frustrating to just go, okay, why? So, let's go into that double fine sweet territory and otherwise have an entire showcasing of certain characters into one episode. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. I would otherwise say that I'm too early to heavily criticize this show still, because ultimately, when looking at it, I think we could have a we could really have a very slow moving progression of us finally figuring out how we can invest in this show. But now we are 2 episodes in, and we have yet to really give us something here. So let's get into spoilers. So we ultimately have it to where this episode is mainly focused within Santana and Damien. And so we ultimately have it to where Damien and Santana are at this like diner, ultimately ordering food, and we get Damien to ultimately tell Santana, hey, they have um, some uh, like uh, witch-esh like food here, and ultimately it's because we ultimately find out that Santana loves biscuits and gravy, and ultimately it's alluding to them having a past together where like he remembers her favorite food. So ultimately Santana, of course, like is stubbornly like, dude, I'm not gonna order that. Like, if anything, I've like I'm watching my calories and everything like that. But then eventually she orders that same meal anyways, um, and I think that that's hilarious. So they they have to where Santana is only here to see her, told me to see her mother, because recently she's going to use Damien to get her there to see her mother, because ultimately she is thinking uh, that this skull has some tie to her mother, and probably has some tie to her otherwise father that they kind of quickly mentioned. But ultimately, Santana tries to dampen that conversation, because Damien mentions that Santana is just like her father, and Santana just says like, I am nothing like my father. So ultimately we end up having it to where we have Damien, who is driving off to some case, because eventually we find somebody desperately trying to drive someone to the hospital, and it ends up that this person is possessed with some demon. And so ultimately this person who's ended up driving this person to the hospital ends up getting into a car accident that is wedging this demon, or this person is into a car accident, and so the demon is kind of keeping this person alive. So we we end up having Satana forcibly going into this mental hospital to talk to the, of course, person that owns it. Um, they're ultimately having like a moment together to kind of like reflect on their past, because ultimately uh, Santana is kind of bitter that we'll just call her June, the person that owns this asylum, because I don't know her actual name. It still hasn't come up within this episode what her name is. And so ultimately, Santana mentions how bitter she is that she couldn't share the same mental hospital that her brother was in. And because ultimately, what ends up happening while the drive of Damien is going on, he mentions to Gabriella that ultimately Santana has kind of had went into mental hospitals, and then eventually end up going from foster home to foster home to foster home to eventually be adopted by somebody that ultimately is living the very much high life, for her to be able to afford all this stuff. So we end up having to where Santana is speaking to June and mentioning, hey, I want to see my mother. I talked to my brother, and he is letting us full well be able, like, letting me to want to be able to see my mother. And June is relenting that she will only let Santana see her mother if she goes with her. And Santana's like, no, like, I want to see my mother and see her alone. And June is relenting, no, the only way you're going to see your mother is with me. So Santana ends up going to see her mother with, of course, June. And so it ends up that reasonably Santana does not really want to actually speak with her mother. Santana wants to speak with the demon inside of her mother. And so, reasonably, Santana is trying to wake this thing up. And ultimately, like, Santana's asking, it's like, well, what happens when my brother is here? What does he do? And so ultimately June is telling Santana, it's like, well, hey, he would bring up stuff from her past to try to wake her up or try to get her to say something. And Santana's like, oh, well, that's nice, but you know what? Like, Santana slaps Victoria, her mother, in the face, and then ultimately the demon speaks. And so ultimately that thrusts June to take Santana out of this room, because ultimately it's like, hey, like, this is not what you're gonna come here to do. If anything, like, if you're gonna slap your mother around, like, no, that's not what you're gonna come here to do. So she immediately pulls her out. But Santana is adamant about seeing her mother, and so ultimately, like, eventually Santana ends up seeing her mother anyways, with June at first with her, but then eventually June leaves because ultimately she starts having a coughing fit, because of course we find out in the last episode that June has seemingly some kind of cancer. So ultimately, in the last episode, she had coughed blood, and so now we're assuming that she yet again has had a coughing fit, which forcibly had her leave. To ultimately, Santana's left alone with Victoria to really talk things out. Ultimately, talking to this demon about their past, and ultimately realistically how seemingly Santana had to be offered up, to where, like, Santana doesn't want to talk to her actual mother because her mother had served her up to seemingly her father, um, which I which was kind of just interesting to me. Ultimately, it seems like her father had like it seems like their father might have been the devil, or might have been something else. Maybe a Mephisto or some other something of sorts, but he must have been some powerful demon. That is, of course, the reason why you don't see him now, or like this and that, whatever, what have you. So basically, it ends up to where, like, it seems that the demon and Santana are just kind of having this like mother daughter moment, which is kind of weird, because the demon doesn't really want to hurt Santana, because ultimately, knowing full well that Santana is a succubus and that she basically kills people, like, there's basically a little bit of demon within her. So why would Victoria as this demon want to take and kill her? Because ultimately, like, they're basically one and the same. So ultimately, there is like these kind of like somber moments where you have Santana putting her head onto her mother's lap, and like she is kind of fiddling with Victoria is fiddling with Santana's hair. like having mother-daughter moments, which is kind of weird because ultimately, like demon to demon, I guess it is what it is because again, Santana doesn't want to talk to her actual mother. She wants nothing to do with her. She is just trying to come up with a conclusion of what is kind of going on. Um, because ultimately we find out that Chris Yen ultimately is putting in some work. He's putting in some work and ultimately looking at the skull that Santana had brought back. And when it ends up happening is it seems that Chris is not only ticked off that caretaker had to come to Chris Yen looking for Zatanna, and of course, like Chris is like, well, like she's gone because ultimately caretaker needs her again and can't find her because ultimately Chris calls her in the very beginning of this episode, and Santana says that she has some family issues that she needs to take care of, and Chris says it's like, well, that's kind of weird for you because you don't do anything like that. So ultimately, of course, as per usual, Santana blows him off and then goes to what she wants to do, leaving Chris to eventually be told um, by caretaker where Santana actually is, but or where caretaker actually thinks that caretaker tells Chris Yen where she thinks Santana might be, but ultimately, because realizing caretaker going to Chris looking for her and realizing that she's gone, he must decipher that okay, she must be with her brother then. So caretaker ends up leaving, and Chris ends up calling Santana upset that ultimately he had to find out um, where Santana was going. It's like why leave him such in the dark or in the lurch? Because ultimately Chris Yen tells caretaker that ultimately Santana had told Chris that ultimately she was doing some family things, and so that's what caretaker had to decipher of just like okay, well, she must be going to her mother then. So Chris ends up bizarrely eventually going into kind of curating some of the pieces that Santana ended up um, going through. He ends up going and looking at the skull that she had brought, and eventually it gets to the point to where Chris ends up taking the skull, and it seems like the skull is bizarrely talking to him to the point to where eventually when somebody ends up some person that it seems that Chris knows is talking to him about work and this and that, Chris eventually is hearing the skull talk to him. It seems that Chris opens the mouth part of the skull to have it bite down on his arm, and then eventually Chris ends up taking some axe from somewhere to seemingly kill this man that comes in, and we're just left in the lurch of okay, what happens after that? So bizarrely, after this whole rigmarole of all this stuff going on, we have Damien end up finding out that there is some demon in the road, and ultimately he had bizarrely ended up getting called by people, to get this demon out of this person before either this family greets him or ultimately get this demon out of this person so this guy can go to heaven. Because if the human dies, he won't go to heaven. So Damien ends up going to this car accident and then eventually meeting this demon, and Gabriella is ultimately wanting this demon to give this man time to talk to his family, and the demon is not letting this happen. Basically, like telling that he's going to confess to this family on how he had a one night stand with some prostitute and any other kind of dark or disturbing like things to have shock value to his own family, because ultimately Damien deciphers that it's like, well, yeah, like this demon only wants to hurt people and give people pain and stuff like that. He doesn't like, of course, he's not going to give this guy his last rites and this and that to be able to give him the moments that he needs. So it ends up that it seems that the demon has a little bit of power left, and because ultimately this demon is tied between these two cars, and ultimately the demon is the only thing keeping this man alive. And so once they pull apart these cars, like the demon is probably still gonna be alive, but the man is gonna be dead. So it ends up that we have it to where the demon just lets the guy talk and gives him his last rites to where Gabriella can kind of take it down to mention to the family like what he wanted to say, because ultimately there's flames all around these vehicles where the family can't get to the car to speak to him. So ultimately the last thing the demon says to Damien is that there's something on the way. There's something big coming. And ultimately we get this bizarrish showcasing of this monster that had seemed to consume somebody or suck the life out of somebody, and it seems like all of his rib cages are out. Like basically looking at like say this is someone's stomach. The stomach has like the ribs poking out of this stomach. But we see this person, of course, from his back. We don't see this person from his front, so we don't know exactly what this person really looks like. It could be anybody. It could probably be the devil. It could probably be Satan. Who knows? But we see like all of this guy's ribs from the back of him popping out of his body and then transition back into his stomach seemingly. So this guy bizarrely has this rib cage that can seem to pop in and out at will, which is weird. But we don't really know what this person is. Like he's supposedly going to be the big bad of this season. So I guess these people at this show had to throw us a bone to say, hey, yeah, we're not really going to show you anything in this episode, but we're going to tell you who the big bad is because we've technically already done that through promo packages and whatever. So, yeah, I don't know who this person is. More than likely, he's probably going to have to be Satan because you would think the son of Satan is probably going to fight Satan himself or Mephisto or whoever it ends up being, whoever the demon or devil is in this world, because I guess that's the only real conclusion that we can really come to, because anything less than that would just be like, okay, why should I have cared? Ultimately, the only thing that I'm thinking is this would ultimately have to be Damien and or Santana's father, whoever this ends up being has to be Damien and Santana's father, because why has their father been gone all this time, and why have they barely brought him up? And shouldn't this have been since day one that they should have been seeking out their father and try to take him down if they knew he could have been a threat? So many questions, so little time, but ultimately we have it to where Damien decides to exorcise this demon out of this guy's body after the demon lets the man say his last rites and tell his family he loves them, and this and that, and tell him proud, like, hey, I'm proud of them, and blah blah blah. Like, okay, it's time for me to go. So Damien exorcises the demon, and that ends up killing both the man and, of course, the demon to go wherever he's going to go. So ultimately, the flames subside, and ultimately, that is kind of where this episode really just ends. Like, I don't think there's anything much of real importance besides that, because ultimately, um, Santana uh, walks out of the room after talking to her mother, and June wants a report of every single thing that Santana had talked to Victoria about, and ultimately, of course, like, Santana is not going to tell her a lick of anything. But it also was kind of funny um, when ultimately in the very beginning of this, when Santana and Damien are at this diner, kind of concluding the little backstories, to ultimately, Santana didn't know that Damien was a teacher. Like, it really shows how far of a distance that Santana and Damien have had through the years, that they didn't really want to try to recontact one another. And there's so much left in the lurch of Santana seemingly not even caring about Damien at all, to not know that he had become a teacher, and because ultimately he had mentioned that, um, hey, like, if anything, if Santana, if you're in town and you need a place to sleep, ultimately Damien was going to offer her a futon, and Santana kind of laughed at him and, like, dude, I'm set up in a 5-star hotel. I'm not going to take your crappy futon. Are you kidding me? Kind of telling them how drastically different they are between one another. And ultimately Santana was like, well, hey, like, I'm gonna let you go ahead and see Mother. It's like, I'm not gonna be able to come with you because I have class tomorrow. And Santana's like, oh, you have, like, class? Are you a student? And he's like, no, I teach. And she's like, oh, wow, that's kind of interesting. So, like, it really shows how distant these characters are. And it seems like Santana, I think, is really a person that wants to keep her distance of everyone. Like, it's really showcasing that every time you see Santana, she wants to keep people even further than arm's length, and ultimately not let anybody in, even the person that she works with. She is basically, as quickly as she goes in to meet him, she quickly leaves. So it's kind of really interesting to see Santana eventually letting someone in, or eventually getting to get any little kernel of knowledge of Santana because of how distant she is. But other than that, I think I'm going to get out of here. I quickly kind of went through this episode more so than probably the first episode, but really there's still not much here yet. And when looking at it, I hope there might be a little bit kernels of knowledge here going into the next episode, or there might finally be an action sequence, I hope. But at the end of the day, if there never is, then hopefully there's some real story here that I'm going to care about. Because if anything, if there's no action, then maybe I can eventually care about certain characters as there is more character building, which I'm assuming there is going to be. I think every episode, like, I think dropping down this entire thing, it's just going to be every single episode is like, okay, here's showcasing an entire episode on one character. I think with the mental hospital asylum like person, June, it's probably going to be doing that through a lot of flashbacks, and I'm assuming caretaker, he's probably going to have his own mission because it seems like he was going to be doing some mission but needed Santana, but she wasn't there. So I'm assuming we're going to have an entire episode of Caretaker and then probably June and then probably Victoria. So that's going to be the next probably 3 episodes. And then I'm just going to be rolling my eyes the rest of the time, just going, ugh, sucks. But that's what I'm assuming is what's going on. More than likely, I'm assuming we're going to start to allude a little bit more and more to whoever this villain is, because ultimately that's going to maybe be the driving force for them to try to figure out who this big bad is. But it's going to be mostly focused on certain people and giving them their own episodes. Is what I'm assuming is going to happen next. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.